Hello to everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending when you're tuning in from. My name is Mihai Chihaia. I'm a policy analyst here at the EPC, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel discussion titled "The War in Gaza: Any Paths Towards a Long-Lasting Ceasefire?" This event today is part of our series of online briefings on the Middle East that analyze developments in the region, that aim to bring different perspectives to mostly a Brussels-based and European audience. And just to continue the previous discussions, the event today will delve into developments of the war in Gaza and regional implications. In our last discussion, a bit over a month ago, we were discussing about the second phase of the ceasefire in Gaza and the slim chances that this would actually go through. Since then, a couple of weeks ago, we've seen the resumption of the war in Gaza, and generally we see a very uncertain picture for the future. In Gaza, we see an uncertain day after as well, but also if we look a bit more regionally, there is a lot of uncertainty. At the same time, we've seen US strikes against the Houthis, who also resumed attacks on Israel and on US naval assets. It's not clear exactly what will be the outcome of the US strikes and how the Houthis will react on the long term. At the same time, if we broaden a little bit the angle, we also have Iran. And there are quite a few open questions here regarding the approach of President Trump towards Iran, what will be the reactions from Iran, whether this momentum to go back to nuclear negotiations with Iran will be continued or will it be derailed? So a lot of open questions pertaining to the region. Of course, there are other fronts at the same time, the front in Lebanon. We have Syria as well in developments there. And the discussion today is just to get a little bit a sense of the developments from the past weeks, what might come next, and how the picture looks like on longer term vis-a-vis Gaza. To tackle all these issues, we have two excellent speakers with us today. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce them. We have with us Dana Stroul, who's the research director from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She's also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East at Department of Defense. And secondly, we have with us Amjad Iraqi, who's an Israel-Palestine consultant at the International Crisis Group and an associate fellow at the Chatham House. We were supposed to also be joined by Silvia Colombo from the NATO Defense College, but unfortunately she had a personal emergency last minute and she is not able to join us. A warm welcome to you both. Thank you very much for joining this EPC discussion. It's also your first time joining our series of events on the Middle East. So a very warm welcome. Just before starting, a couple of thoughts on the run of show. We'll have a few opening remarks and then a couple of questions from my side towards our speakers. And then we'll go ahead and open the floor to questions for the audience. If you want to pose a question, please write it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will read it out loud and then we'll see who is best placed to address it. I will just encourage you to pose your questions early on. We have about 55 minutes left, which usually passes very fast. So please do go ahead and pose your questions as early as possible. From the previous events in this series, sometimes there is a multitude of questions that come in towards the end, and we don't have time to tackle them all. I think without further ado, I'll turn to our guest today, and I'm looking at you, Dana. And maybe so my first sort of question would be, how do you see the recent developments in the U.S. approach, in Trump's administration approach to the Middle East? How do you assess it in what has happened in the past weeks? And how should this approach look like? How do you see, maybe a more provocative question, how do you see a US approach towards the Middle East different than the one that is taking place today. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me, and a pleasure to be here with you, with Amjad, and with EPC. Why don't I start by sharing a sense of where I believe the Washington, D.C. view was on where we were at the beginning of the year. So January 2025, as there was a transition from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, some of the changes we've seen since, and what I think this means going forward. So first of all, the Biden administration put in place a series of policies after the Hamas attack of October 7, 2023, both to support Israel's self-defense and its ability to both dismantle Hamas's military infrastructure in Gaza, but also defend itself from all of the other fronts that opened up in the aftermath of October 7th. But the other broad interest was to prevent full-scale regional escalation. And that, I think, is been a contentious area, because what we've seen since October 7th is without question war. But the assumption and view in Washington is that it could get so much worse, to a full-scale regional conflagration where you had consistent state-on-state attacks, plus a rise up and activation of Iran's full proxy and threat network across the region, plus an assault on international shipping, free flow of commerce, in a way in which societies and states all have to mobilize at the same time, both inside the region, and then what the implications would have been for those outside the region. So the view was that despite all of the instability, the conflict, the collateral damage, the loss in civilian lives that we saw from October 7 onward, that it could get so much worse. And it turns out that while the Biden administration took a bunch of different measures to support Israel's defense and then increased its own military posture to maintain or prevent more escalation in the region, the events of 2024 are just tectonic, seismic in what happened. And I think it's important to go over several of them. Israel, through the Israel Defense Forces, largely dismantled a significant amount of Hamas's military infrastructure in Gaza, neutralized a significant amount of Hamas's terror tunnel infrastructure, and did eliminate a significant amount of its weapons caches. We now know, of course, that that work was incomplete, since we've seen a return on the other side of ceasefire, to combat operations. Then in Lebanon, Hezbollah activated its front in the north starting on October 8th. And since October 8th until December of 2024, linked its escalation from Lebanon toward Israel to Israel's operation in Gaza. And there again, the military achievements over the course of 2024, I think, is something that many viewed as possible when this started on October 8th, 2023. So the majority of Hezbollah's senior leadership has been killed. A significant amount of Hezbollah's military caches and strategic weapons that could threaten Israel's existence have been eliminated. And so many of the mid-level commanders and tactical officers have also been killed in such a manner that Hezbollah was so weakened that it eventually delinked its campaign from support for Hamas and Gaza and agreed to ceasefire terms last December that are very favorable to Israel. Not to mention, since that time, we've seen the emergence of new leaders in Beirut who are talking about actually enforcing UN Security Council resolutions to complete the disarmament of Hezbollah and to bring all armed groups under the authority, not under the authority, but basically that any groups operating outside the authority of the state should disarm, and that the state should have a complete monopoly on the use of force. Very hard to have imagined what we would see in Lebanon now before October 7. Then Syria. Here, with the ouster of Bashar al-Assad and the failure of Russia and Iran to back him up and ensure the survival of his regime, a totally different context in Syria, again, opening up new possibilities. Worth just revisiting that Assad and Bashar, and before that his father, willingly permitted the use of Syrian territory for Iran's land bridge from Tehran through Baghdad, Damascus to Beirut to supply Iran's network of non-state actors. Iran was maintaining weapons caches, production facilities, flowing fighters, money all through Syrian territory. Syria, at one point under the Assad regime, had a nuclear weapons program. It still has a chemical weapons program. This is a regime who let violent Sunni extremists out of its prisons in order to flow into Iraq to kill U.S. forces. This became al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually led to ISIS, which destabilized the entire region and at one point held large swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria, still active in pockets of Syria and Iraq even today. So the epicenter of instability for a long time in the Middle East has been Syria. And again, through a series of actions unexpected, I think on October 7th, based on what happened over the course of the year 2024, significant new opportunities. Finally, generally, Iran's approach to ensuring the survival and the protection of the regime has been to use asymmetric power, to invest in this network of proxies, terrorist organizations beyond its borders to keep war and conflict away from Iranian territory. 2024 was also a threshold crossing event here. So first of all, in April of last year, we see Iran directly attack Israel in a complex attack of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. And not only does that attack emanate from Iranian territory, but the Iranian regime directly claims responsibility and says this is a conventional overt attack on Israel. Threshold crossing event for the use of military force in the region. Secondly, last April, we actually saw an effective multilateral coalition come together to defeat Iran's attack. Again, an unprecedented development in the region. So the United States, working with European militaries, Arab militaries, and Israel, all worked together over the course of April 13 to April 14, 2024, and defeat Iran's attack. So a fear barrier of how the region would defend itself against this kind of Iranian attack has been lowered. Then fast forward to October of last year, rather than a complex mix of ballistic and cruise missiles and drones, Iran opts for 180 ballistic missiles directed just at Israel. And again, Israel successfully defends itself against this attack with some U.S. participation. And in response, Israel strikes in Iran first in April of last year and again in October of last year. And in October, takes out Iran's strategic air defenses and part of its military industrial complex that produces components for its ballistic missile arsenal. So the table is set in a very different way. Early 2025 of this year, we had ceasefires in Gaza, a ceasefire in Lebanon, what looked like a honeymoon period in Syria, where a new interim government under the leadership of Ahmed al-Shara was working diligently to consolidate security control and begin to establish an inclusive non-sectarian governance. For Syria, there was movement in Iraq, the Houthi threat in the Red Sea that had also been linked to Israel's campaign in Gaza had died down for the moment. And one could imagine the possibility of transitioning from military operations to political processes that actually deliver sustainable outcomes. Here's what the possibilities are for this year should we actually manage to transition from combat operations to political processes. There's an opportunity to imagine a region and put in place the architecture of a region that is not dominated by malign Iranian influence. There's an opportunity, given the degradation of Iran's threat network and the fact that its conventional weapons arsenal can be defeated, to actually negotiate for some sustainable outcome on blocking Iran's path to a nuclear weapon capability. The architecture of the region with Israel, its peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, the Abraham Accords agreements with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco are all holding, and there is still a possibility of normalization with Saudi Arabia. Continuing this path of integration, normalization, not just in the security sector, but people to people, economy to economy, trade, education, tourism, etc., would address what is the least integrated region in the world, being the Middle East. So the possibility of moving forward on normalization. And of course, normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia would also demand progress on the Palestinian file. So a real day after plan for Gaza, something on the West Bank, and progress toward a two-state solution. Those were the big opportunities. And where I think we are right now is actually a return to a very kinetic phase. We've seen the ceasefire not hold in Gaza. Very difficult to envision what an outcome is. At this point, Hamas and Israel's stated objectives for an outcome in Gaza are mutually incompatible. And Israel has the full backing of the Trump administration in returning to its military operations. We've seen a very kinetic few weeks in Lebanon with returned Israeli strikes even in the heart of Lebanon in Beirut. March saw some really terrible sectarian violence in Syria, as well as a very steady, deeper Israeli campaign into Syria. And of course, we've seen the Houthis return to sending ballistic missiles both into the Red Sea and toward Israel, and the announcement of a very significant campaign directed by President Trump to dislodge the Houthis, which is more expansive in geography, targets, and scope than what happened in the Biden administration. So in conclusion, for now, I'd say what we've seen from the Trump administration, and this is less than 100 days in, is a plus up even more of U.S. military posture in the region from what it inherited from the Biden administration. We now have more aircraft, another aircraft carrier at sea, more air defense flowing into the region, an announcement of a return to the maximum pressure campaign. So these are coercive tools, more military pressure, more sanctions pressure. And at the same time, the president has said he would like to bring peace and he would like to negotiate with the Iranians. Whether or not this mix of a lot of reliance on, I think, pressure tools while extending an open diplomatic hand remains to be seen. But what is quite clear is 2025 is going to be a decisive year, and decisions made, I think, both in the Middle East, in Tehran, and in Washington about stepping back from the precipice of even more military force and potentially that regional escalation into something even more intense than what we've seen since October 7th is a real possibility. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dana. You created this outlook going back to 2023 to 2024. You put things into context. So thank you very much for that. At the same time, also thank you for outlining the opportunities that are there at this point in the region. While of course keeping in mind that now we, to use your words, we return to a kinetic phase of the conflict in the Middle East. I will turn back to you in 1 second, but I just wanted to bring Amjad in, and I want just to zoom in a little bit more on the ceasefire in Gaza and how it broke down, and whether do you see any way to come back to a ceasefire right now? Can you give us a little bit of a few thoughts on where we are right now? Thank you.
First of all, thanks very much, EPC, for having me. Thank you, Dana, as well, for that regional layout. So I have kind of three sort of clusters of opening remarks. So in terms of the first question about how the ceasefire broke down, now naturally, these kind of ceasefires are always very complex, a lot of details, but to kind of get to the brass tacks, the bottom line is that the Israeli government basically saw that there was more to be gained by breaking the ceasefire deal that went into effect on January 19th. and saw more gains by breaking it than necessarily keeping it. And in fact, during the duration of the ceasefire over the weeks, while there was these backs and forths from Hamas and Israel, what we actually saw was an active attempt to rewrite the terms of the deal as it was also being implemented. And I'm sure it sounds from your previous conversation about whether they would get to phase two, that this was actually being observed, that we were seeing that being rewritten before our eyes. Now, back in January, I mean, the Crisis Group and many others have been were warned about several flaws with the ceasefire deal, which was imperfect but quite vital. But one of the biggest problems with the deal essentially was that you did not really have equal motivations to preserve it. So on one side, for Hamas and for Palestinians writ large, the ceasefire is actually quite existential. For the 2 million plus Gazans, of course, it was an attempt to break the siege, to allow in humanitarian aid, to stop the ground offensives and the airstrikes. It was a desperately needed respite for the civilian population, who've also been massively displaced, suffered tens of thousands killed. And for Hamas itself, in addition to wanting Gaza to be able to take that breather, it was for itself as an organization to kind of regroup, reassert itself, begin to use its leverage through hostages in order to extract more out of Israel. So for them, there was a very clear vested interest in maintaining that ceasefire. Now, unfortunately, the same could not necessarily be said on the Israeli side. Now, on the one hand, you have, of course, the most who were vested in that were families of hostages, the hostages themselves, and people who supported the hostage families to ensure their release as part of the truce. But you also had kind of three main levels on the Israeli front, which actually which saw that it was better to return to war. And this is why many people were quite pessimistic about the deal lasting past the first phase. On that first level, you of course have Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who I think it's no secret to say his personal and political crises and considerations have been very central to the way that Israel's been conducting this war, even against the opposition of many in his Israeli security establishment, in the Israeli public, and everything from the corruption trials to maintaining his coalition. And these are all very well known. So on that level, it was quite evident that Netanyahu would want to return to war. A second level is actually about the Israeli military itself. So a few weeks ago, the IDF brought in a new chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, who took over Herzi Halevi. And Zamir has seemed to be, it's only been a couple of weeks, but he seems a bit more aligned with some of the agendas, some of the ambitions of the Israeli government. Not necessarily for those ideological reasons, but Zamir from the very get-go put forward a kind of more aggressive and more ambitious military plan for what it would look like if the Israelis returned to war in Gaza, and that we're actually seeing that unfold right now. And this kind of creates this sort of maximum pressure approach, both to try to get Hamas to give more concessions regarding the hostages, irrespective of what was agreed on the ceasefire. You also have the fact that Zamir is more open to the idea of the military actually having a bit more of a long-term presence inside Gaza, something that his predecessor Halevi was a bit more resistant to. And so you're actually starting to see these plans unfold as the IDF takes on new leadership. And then the third level of this on the Israeli side is the far-right coalition itself, many of whom have been very explicit and are even putting the money and the institutional backing to essentially see the mass expulsion of Palestinians in Gaza. Something that might have been considered quite fringe or impossible several years ago or decades ago is now something that is trying to be operationalized as we speak. And so all this, of course, is also being with the backing, or at least with the principled backing of what was the Trump idea of taking over Gaza and emptying it to the population in order to sort of restore it to this kind of Middle East Riviera. So these kind of three levels on the Israeli side, combined with of course, the Trump administration, which had sort of been playing two sides of the coin over the past few weeks, both being very critical and muscling through that ceasefire agreement. But then also we've seen it go back and forth and different officials saying different things, and ultimately them siding with kind of putting all their eggs into the Israeli basket and saying, you have the green light to go back into war, after they tried to similarly rewrite the agreement about how many hostages to release in exchange for longer ceasefires and aid, etc. So this is essentially how it's broke down. They're obviously quite complex, and there are other factors, including Hamas, but I think the power asymmetry with which the ceasefire is inherently built on and those vested interests meant that it was very sadly kind of doomed to fail. Now, in terms of what that's looking like on the ground, it's quite devastating, to be honest. You're essentially seeing the further dismantling of Gaza as a political and social entity, both ostensibly to destroy Hamas as an organization and as a governing body, along with its military infrastructure. But you're also seeing a total redesigning or continued redesigning of the Gaza Strip and its infrastructure, its demographics, etc. You've been seeing since the beginning of March a total siege, no trucks going into Gaza. So that's 2 million plus people being collectively punished. You're seeing massive evacuation orders and displacements of tens or hundreds of thousands of people, crunching the Gazan population further and further towards the coastline and away from the perimeters. Combined with that is the fact that the IDF is openly saying that they're going to seize, and they are actively seizing more territory in the Gaza Strip, again, for indefinite periods of time. We're seeing hearings from the IDF, from the defense minister, and so on. You're seeing airstrikes all across the Strip, which are almost explicitly not just targeting Hamas militants or militant infrastructure, but also more explicitly targeting the political echelon and people who are responsible for kind of taking on sort of governing and civilian duties, or even have Hamas spokespeople who are targets. And this has been the case also from the beginning of the war, but the Israeli strategy is to say that we want to actually make Hamas's capacity to govern impossible. But that de facto means that you make Gaza itself inherently ungovernable, or rendering it even further ungovernable. Now, of course, you've also seen a rocket fire from Hamas or potentially other groups inside Gaza towards Israel, which are disrupting life and showing that there's still some limited capacity despite the severe degradation. But again, there's this, we're still obviously only 2 weeks in, almost 3 weeks in, but the effect on the ground is quite severe. And these alignments of what is destroying Hamas, what is destroying Gaza, and what is happening to the 2 million people who are there raises really serious questions about the very dangerous moment that we're in. And the last thing, just to close off in terms of how to potentially restore the ceasefire, I mean, I have to be quite bleak in that the government's interests have not really changed on wanting to return to war. Even if Hamas concedes a bit more on some of the hostages and actually decides to agree to some of these new bridging proposals that are being put forward, it's the government or some of the Israeli echelon, they're not really likely to let go of some of those larger political and strategic calculations that they have for Gaza, whether it's for Hamas or Gaza without Hamas. And we've seen the very fact that this ceasefire, imperfect as it was, still served as a solid basis to release the hostages, to get somewhere forward. There's no guarantee that a shorter-term ceasefire will actually buy us further cessations down the line. And in fact, we'll see that those agendas will still remain in place. And so trying to be a bit sobering about it, but there are only potentially 4 main pressure points where you can calculate that this might affect the course of the war, or whether or not it actually freezes up, short of a deal on hostages and other cessations. One is that the fighting on the ground just makes it very difficult for the Israeli army to pursue all its operations and all its agendas as the chief of staff has planned. The second level is just internal Israeli fighting. The fact that Netanyahu is, fighting left, right, and center on many fronts. You have the fact that there are army reservists who are not showing up for duty as they were before. You dropped it down to 50%, who are people who are showing up for the reserves. Any potential further civil unrest regarding the hostages. So anything that's happening inside the Israeli politics and society could obviously affect the course of those operations. The third level are the Arab states, which keep in mind that a month ago, they endorsed an Egyptian drafted plan for Gaza's recovery and reconstruction. And there's, all these plans need to be taken with grains of salt, along with the willingness to back it up. But a critical factor here is how much the Arab states, and particularly Egypt and Saudi Arabia in particular, will want to use their muscle to insist that plan gets put forward in order to stop the war. And all these Arab states are, of course, involved in the mediation of trying to get a ceasefire back on the table, but it would require more from them in order to set that kind of day after plan and to convince the Israelis that it meets some of the political security questions, which is a far way off for now. And the fourth and last one, of course, is naturally the United States and the Trump administration. And Dana laid out some of the considerations that they have coming up this year, but it'll be up to the Trump administration to decide whether it not becomes too costly for Israel to actually continue this war in Gaza. Not necessarily for the Palestinians' sake, but because there are larger geopolitical regional plans that are at foot. And as I said, the Trump administration has been on both sides of the fence on this. And so we'll also see if Arab states might be able to convince the White House to take a different course vis-a-vis Netanyahu and the Israeli administration. Otherwise, you're in a state whereby we're seeing this high intensity war. You're in a very likely scenario of a direct reoccupation of Gaza, one that will only continue to be permanent, and potentially the mass expulsion of Palestinians, which is now an increased serious threat. I'll stop there for now, and I'm sure there's lots to unpack, but hope that lays out some of those things.
Well, thank you, Amjad. Indeed, a lot to unpack, but thank you very much for also going into the internal Israeli angle. And I like that you put forward these sort of three dimensions on the Israeli government, the IDF, and then the far right. Here, I mean, just from the top of my mind, just a quick question is on the public opinion, on the Israeli public opinion, because we've seen quite a few protests lately. Maybe sort of what is sort of the general feeling among the Israeli population, while at the same time we've also seen protests in Gaza, right, against Hamas. How do you sort of evaluate those protests? In which light do you see them? Then, of course, you also rightly pointed out these pressure points, and I'm sure we'll go into them a little bit later, especially the Arab states' position, but also the Trump's administration view of a return to the ceasefire. And I'll come back to you in a minute, Dana, on the view from Washington regarding a potential return to ceasefire. But firstly, just to stay with you, Amjad, about the public opinion, if you could say a few words, I think this would help us better understand the internal context. Thank you.
Certainly. So on the Israeli public front, according to most polls and from what you can see from Jewish Israeli public discussions, by and large, you're seeing most of the population is in support of a ceasefire deal that sees the release of hostages. So it's obviously shifted here and there, and there are different interpretations of what that ceasefire looks like, but you can see a very favorable opinion to try to get those hostages out, even if it means stopping the war, even if it means Hamas stays in power for the time being, that is still an utmost priority. Unfortunately, the government is not really paying heed to that. And as I said, they have these other vested interests that are there. But again, you're also seeing the consequence of that even the soldiers who participated in the war or who came out in high numbers at the beginning are now becoming increasingly disillusioned with, why are we going in there? Why is, Hamas is clearly not destroyed. Again, a great deal of distrust between the public and the government, between the government and the army. But unfortunately, Prime Minister Netanyahu has a very long record and talent for kind of shirking off public opinion on a lot of these fronts. The course of this war has demonstrated that. The hostage situation has clearly demonstrated that. Now, yes, you're seeing quite a lot of protests and a lot of pushback both on this war, but also on numerous fronts regarding the prime minister himself, as he's chipping away, and he and his coalition are chipping away further and further at these internal checks and balances in the Israeli government bureaucracy, which are alarming many Israelis. But the government and the army is still kind of going full speed ahead. And the protests haven't really, they've of course captured the public imagination, but they're not really having any political capital or real severe disruption to the government's plans at this moment. Again, it's early to tell right now in terms of the restoration of the war, how much that can transpire. But right now we're in this kind of deadlock, and that state is still able to go about it regardless of what the public thinks. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that Israelis will be against going back into Gaza or returning to war once the hostages are released. And again, these are some of the debates that are being had. But yeah, this is the kind of blockage that you're having. Now, regarding some of these protests in Gaza, I think it's important to kind of clarify a couple of things. Yes, on the one hand, you've been seeing these demonstrations, most of them quite spontaneous, especially in northern Gaza. But there's been a few mischaracterizations. So most of these protests are by and large actually anti-war protests. They're just demanding a stoppage to the war, trying to get international attention, demanding that aid comes in immediately. It is about survival and just wanting to stop no matter what. Now, a segment of those are more explicitly against Hamas itself. But I think that media attention is focused quite a lot on this segment and sort of mischaracterizing it as if somehow that the war is working and actually kind of stoking this sort of anti-Hamas sentiment. Now, to be quite sure, many Gazans are actually quite furious at Hamas as a political party, as an authoritarian government, even before October 7th, and many of them even criticize and question the October 7th assault and the price that they've had to pay in the year and a half. But this is, of course, in addition to Gazans who do still support Hamas as a movement, and those who might, even if they despise the Hamas as a party, will not necessarily question the right to for armed fighters to resist the Israeli army and the occupation. So it's a very kaleidoscopic view. So it can't just be it's not really a binary. And so these demonstrations, they are reflective of a sentiment that's certainly there, but even a lot of the protesters there are quite blatant about that, as much as they oppose Hamas on several fronts, that again, that the thing that needs to be centered is Israeli siege, is Israeli return to war. Now, where this goes politically, the only way to actually advance this constructively and to actually give Palestinians a bit more, much more of a say in how they want to deal with this politically is to actually bring about a ceasefire. As long as the war continues, the Israeli kind of calculus somehow is that this will actually help to increase that pressure on Hamas. But Hamas, as I've said, is very intent on achieving that ceasefire. And for a lot of Gazans, it does not take away their focus that their primary adversary right now is Israel, is Israeli military, is Israeli government. So these are just to complexify these matters a bit. But in order to make this constructive, you need to get back to that ceasefire. And I apologize, you had a second level of questions, but I'm happy to pause here and hand it off to Dana. So.
Oh, thank you, Amjad. Indeed, it's very important to sort of clarify these dimensions of protest, so we have a clear picture of what is actually happening on the ground. Maybe now I'll go back to my previous question, and going back to you, Dana. To maybe we can sort of see how a return to ceasefire is seen in Washington. What's the feeling there? Is there a pressure to go back to the ceasefire? What's the thinking at this point?
Thanks for the question. So first of all, I think there isn't really a consensus view in Washington. I think there's actually quite a lively debate about the best way to go forward. I'm going to add a few observations and thoughts to what Amjad already said. First of all, when I talked about what has happened in the region and in Gaza since October 7, I think it's important to understand that from an Israeli perspective, their lesson learned or takeaways that military pressure works. Because military pressure, and a sense that Hezbollah was under pressure, Hamas was under pressure, and then that some amount of military pressure worked on Bashar al-Assad, that military pressure can actually lead to an outcome that can secure an objective. So that's number one. Number two is what Prime Minister Netanyahu promised when they started the campaign in Gaza was total victory. And as hostages were being released in that first phase of the ceasefire, when the world saw these elaborate staging ceremonies, Hamas coming out in their uniforms with their weapons, and heard the accounts of the terrible trauma and terror that these hostages suffered, in no way can Netanyahu say to the Israeli people that this is total victory. And I think one of the main debates in Israeli, again, Israeli public opinion is clearly not monolithic on this. The core tension right now is what is the best way to get the hostages out and then have total victory. But this idea of dislodging Hamas not only from its military dominance in Gaza, but governance infrastructure, and how that is sequenced with getting the rest of the hostages out, I think is a core tension right now, and problem for Netanyahu and for Israel. So where a potential flashpoint is from Washington is that there's one remaining American Israeli hostage, Idan Alexander. And of course, there's been a lot of engagement from the Trump administration, and we've seen reports of uncoordinated and unclear attempts on how to secure the release of Mr. Alexander, from direct negotiations with Hamas to returning to the model that the president's envoy, Steve Witkoff, inherited from the Biden administration, which is this Qatar, Egypt, Israel, U.S. negotiation with Hamas in an indirect approach to this format. And the point here, I think, is there's a time urgency for the hostages. They have less time. And as the hostages, I think, are more and more vocal that have come out and really said that the return to military operations is going to endanger the lives of these hostages. It's hard to see how Netanyahu sustains that political pressure and says that he convinces the Israeli people that he's committed to actually getting hostages out that are still alive. Okay. So from a Washington perspective, I think there's a real focus on the hostages. And the other development or trend here in Washington is that a lot of the hostages that came out in January and February have been very active here. Several of them were on a big TV show here, 60 Minutes, where they appealed directly to President Trump that he can secure the release of these hostages. And I think what's noteworthy here is we have Israeli hostages appealing to the American president, not to the Israeli government and not to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And it really does, I think, shine a light on this tension that Amjad was talking about with Netanyahu, some of his other challenges at this moment in time, and the constraints he has on how to shape winding down combat operations because of his very right-wing governing coalition. However, nobody here in Washington, I would say that Hamas should stay in Gaza, should have a say over the political future of Gaza, or should have a role in governing Gaza. So when Amjad says Palestinians will have a voice in the future of Gaza governance if there is a ceasefire, that is probably a difference of view here in Washington, which is that because of Hamas's the terrorizing way in which they have both exerted governance, diverted humanitarian aid, intimidated the civilian population that might not be supportive of them. And we've even seen these horrific reports of Hamas torturing and leaving the bodies of some of the organizers of the protests on the front doors of their families. This doesn't look like a situation in which Palestinians can have a voice if there's a ceasefire. And this core issue of how do you have a ceasefire and move forward in Gaza without a Hamas role, I think is a core area of tension with Trump's vision for how this works and what we heard from the Cairo plan that Amjad also talked about. So after the Trump Riviera, the U.S. will take ownership, all of these issues. You saw Arab leaders come together in Cairo and put out this plan for an alternative to how stability and a day after plan could happen in Gaza. And I think there are some important things that were put in that proposal and provide a foundation from which to work. But the flaw is that there's not a clear acknowledgement of how you dislodge Hamas, get the rest of its leadership out of Hamas, and actually give Palestinians that chance to articulate and have agency over their future. So these are, I think, are the core tensions in the Washington approach. And also, as we go forward here, the difference between the military operations now and what we saw over the course of 24 is that you have the U.S. administration supporting Israel in blocking humanitarian aid deliveries and not providing electricity to Gaza, which will have implications, for example, for desalination plants. This was an area of tension between the Biden administration and the Israeli government in the past. So how this plays out, I'm not sure. And of course, something that is an unknown for everybody is what President Trump's reaction will be, because that tends to vary and change day by day and sometimes hour by hour.
Thank you, Dana. I feel, Amjad, you want to come in on that, on the Arab plan and how to move forward without Hamas in the region. So I'm just going to give you the floor, and then I'll come back with I see a question in the Q&A, and hopefully more will come in, and then I also have some other follow-up questions. But I'll give you now the floor to react to that.
No, I mean, no, Dana laid it out correctly in terms of how the Israeli political discussions and the Washington discussions are about this. Where the gap is, especially on how Palestinians, I think some Arab states and Arab discourse is kind of speaking about this. So I think it's important to also note that Hamas, even before this war, has actually been has signaled quite clearly that they are not interested in governing Gaza alone. They're not interested in returning to the same kind of place that they had pre-October 7th. And you're seeing this also kind of reaffirmed on two fronts. One is that Hamas is actually actively still engaged in reconciliation talks with the Fatah Party that runs a Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, led by President Mahmoud Abbas. And these talks, there's much to say about them, and they've been going on for well over a year. But part of one of the focal points is to kind of set this like a technocratic committee. Right now, it's kind of shifting more towards being under the auspices of the Palestinian Authority, which will be made up mostly of independent experts who are approved by both parties, or at least acquiesced to even by Hamas. And Hamas is kind of serving this now de facto governing role for the civilian population. And that's also why it's still playing out these duties. So the site of their presence and the fact that Hamas police are coming out in Gaza is the fact that there is no authority right now and to manage all these basic needs for people. Until such a technocratic committee can be agreed upon, and especially once Mahmoud Abbas as president gives the final green light on this technocratic committee. Despite significant progress in these talks, you often find that Abbas and kind of these closest circles will tend to undermine it because they fear kind of what this might entail for their power and ceding some of that authority. And these are some of these complex reconciliation talks. And so the second level of where you're seeing the signaling as well is actually the Arab League plan, which actually incorporates a lot of the PA's own kind of initial reconstruction plan. It sees a revitalized PA and PLO that actually incorporates all political factions. Notably, the plan does not explicitly name Hamas, but in the parameters that they're kind of espousing, which very much echoes the Arab League plan of 2002 and a lot of these other basic principles, is that they see this integration of the one nation, one gun, which with the PA as kind of the primary agent. And Hamas itself actually welcomed the Arab League plan, even with its reservations. And so you're actually seeing these signalings that it is willing to kind of integrate itself into a more national rubric, but it is also facing those blockages. And this is not just to put all the credit on Hamas, because it itself, as Dana mentioned, is still an active combatant in these things. The question about what its weapons and its armed groups will do in this situation, how to successfully integrate it, I think that's where Palestinian conversations are at, which is that gap between how Israelis and a lot of Americans in DC are perceiving it. Now, that gap again reflects a long-standing kind of issue whereby right now you're still having a position whereby Gaza's fate is still being determined not by Palestinians but by other actors, more so than Palestinians themselves. And I guess in terms of trying to think constructively forward, and this relates also to European policy, it relates to the American policy thinking on this, is that we can't, or especially Palestinians don't want to be in a situation where they're put under another kind of protectorate, where they're kind of seeing the occupation by other means. They're also seeing the flaws of the Palestinian Authority, which took a very different approach to Hamas and actually is in support of security coordination, actually aligns with the Israeli military and its operations. And yet it is finding that in the West Bank, you're still seeing processes of annexation. You're seeing massive invasions of Palestinian cities, massive economic closures, a complete stifling of the territory, again, with some of the alignments that you're seeing in Gaza in terms of Israeli interests in that, or are you also seeing it in the West Bank? So they're deeply interconnected for Palestinians on the ground, even as more powerful states than them are kind of determining a lot of these factors and kind of putting X's on a lot of what kind of agency and what Hamas's role in this kind of national rubric. Their capacity to still disrupt some of these regional plans, their capacity to disrupt the Israeli agendas, the occupation, even American plans, I think is very evident. So this is something to really consider, that without actually getting the Palestinians to have that say, as uncomfortable as it is for certain actors, and that's also uncomfortable for Arab states, then I think you're going to be in a very complicated situation where you're actually not finding stabilization, but you're only ensuring the next stages of this asymmetrical warfare on the ground.
If I can just add here, Amjad said there's a gap on how this moves forward, and I think it's really worth underscoring and emphasizing. I think it's more than a gap. I think it's a fault line. So this idea that Hamas has said the right things about participating in a reconciliation process or a national framework is a non-starter from Washington. And I actually think that's an area where there's relative unity of view here in the United States, even if there's disagreements about the return to war in Gaza, delivery of humanitarian aid, conduct of the Israel Defense Forces. The idea that Hamas and its leaders, who still talk about wanting to do October 7th-like attacks over and over and over, and are still holding living Israeli hostages after the horrific revelations of the treatment of the past hostages, or the hostages that have been released alive, would have any role in governance in Gaza is seen as absolutely unacceptable. And so this fault line of what does Palestinian governance look like with no role for Hamas when it won't relinquish that level of any role, I think is going to be a major area of tension. And I think here the view is, if Hamas actually cared about the Palestinian people in Gaza, it has been given an opportunity, its leaders, to leave the Strip. And that is a core area and fault line here. And with respect to the West Bank, I agree with Amjad. There are such, the manner of Israeli policies currently being implemented in the West Bank, I think it's only a matter of time before you have collapse of the Palestinian economy, what's left of Palestinian governance, Palestinian security forces. And here, President Trump has set a priority for him is Israel-Saudi normalization. And it's hard to see any path forward on that if there aren't adjustments to Israeli policies for how to bring about and enable space for Palestinian governance in Gaza and some breathing room to stabilize in the West Bank. And so here again is where I think some of the core tensions could play out over the coming year.
Thank you to you both. Maybe I'd just like to bring in a couple of questions from the audience, and then seeing that we have about 8 minutes left, maybe just throw in one last question from my side. So I'm just going to read them out loud. So the EU hasn't been mentioned. Does that reflect its complete irrelevance in this context, or is there still a meaningful role it could play in pushing for the restoration of ceasefire? That's question number one on the EU and its potential role on the restoration of the ceasefire. And maybe just to add another layer, what role could the EU play in the day after in Gaza? I think that's something interesting to reflect on. And the second question is, since the accusations against UNRWA and the resulting loss of credibility, what are the credible alternatives for managing the flow of Palestinian refugees in the Middle East? Maybe I'll just give you the floor now to just pick up on any of the points from these questions, and then I'll go with the last question for you both. Please go ahead.
Let me start with the EU question. So as a baseline statement, I think there's always a role for the EU to play in the Middle East, and particularly at a moment in time, let me start broad before going to Gaza specifically, where the United States is actively dismantling its assistance programs, its technical experts, and taking a step back from what has traditionally been a very active diplomatic, multilateral organizing, humanitarian aid delivering, stabilization and reconstruction assistance providing country and leader. I see enormous space for the European Union to lead in what could be a very significant vacuum of American leadership and presence on the ground, other than through the military instrument. It's a very fraught time, in my view, for the Middle East, and I certainly hope that the European Union steps up and fills some of those gaps. Specifically on Gaza, I think that there absolutely is a European role to play in a day after scenario. It's clear that the United States will not completely fund reconstruction or stabilization. There will be competing demands for many of the Arab leaders and governments, especially in the Gulf. We need a significant marshaling of resources for Syria, for Lebanon, for Yemen. We haven't talked about Libya in this situation. We haven't talked about Iraq recovering post-ISIS in this situation, in this conversation. The needs, I think, are so great and so vast. No question that there's a role for the EU. There will also need to be EU advocacy with international financial institutions, with UN missions, a variety of different political structures and frameworks for how stabilizing the region happens. But with respect to actually getting to another cessation of hostilities in Gaza, some of this is about working with the Arab neighbors. Some of this is about pressure on Hamas, and a lot of it is about working with Israel. And I think at this point in time, there's a major trust deficit between European countries and Israel, given the criticisms of Israel, the halt in defense article sales to Israel, the support for cases against Israel and the International Court of Justice and at the ICC, et cetera. So I think there is, in terms of actually moving from where we are at this moment in time to a situation in which we can get more hostages out and actually move towards what a political framework might be and day after governance. To me, the U.S. role, because of the relationship with Israel, remains preeminent. But the EU has extensive, deep, and consistent channels across the Middle East, and I hope that it uses them.
I'll start off with the UNRWA question first. The fact of the matter is, there is not really any agency or institution that can replace UNRWA on the ground in Gaza or in the West Bank or on the Palestinian refugee question. So just to remind everyone, officially UNRWA is now practically or effectively outlawed by the Israeli government, according to Knesset laws that went into effect at the end of January, but UNRWA is actually still operating on the ground. So the laws have been are enacted, but the implementation is still limited, aside from in East Jerusalem, which Israel kind of deems as within its official borders. Now, in the past few weeks, or I guess 2 months now since the laws have been in effect, UNRWA, in partnership with the World Food Program and other UN agencies and aid agencies, they're still playing a central role, not just for the Palestinian refugee question, but in aid provision. And that expertise and that and the fact that UNRWA has been so central to Palestinian life and society for ages, that can't be taken for granted. The fact that UNRWA actually is made up largely of Palestinian employees who know the society, who know their way around, who are also deeply affected by the war themselves, and that includes in the West Bank, not just in Gaza, makes them an indispensable agency. And a lot of governments, including from Europe, have been quite insistent that actually Israel should not implement those laws, that UNRWA remains so central. But so far, you're actually seeing not enough muscle being put behind those declarations. And this is where I think Europe needs to kind of step up a bit more, even just on the humanitarian aid front. UNRWA obviously has its identity regarding the refugee question, and even just on the humanitarian provision, UNRWA's existence is absolutely vital. But as their chief commissioner, Philip Lazzarini, has been saying, like, they really are on the precipice. And so this is only going to deteriorate that potential humanitarian spiral in Gaza and now in the West Bank as the conditions get worse there. And so the question of an alternative, I think, is very difficult, if not potentially impossible to answer. The Israeli army right now, part of its plan or part of its agenda is that they want to try taking on some of those humanitarian provisions, basically kind of restoring how the occupation functioned before the Palestinian Authority came about under the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, and even stripping UNRWA of that role, which had that role as far back for several decades. But this comes with many different questions and problems, and again, the course of the war will tell us whether that can actually transpire. So I think restoring UNRWA, saving it, and making sure it plays that role is really crucial. And just the last point on Europe. Europe carries a huge amount of leverage, both vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians. It's just not capable, or does not seem politically capable of exercising that. We've seen in the past Europe has tended to has known how to set quite firm sticks vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority, vis-a-vis the Palestinians when it comes to perceived violations of any kind to the Oslo Accords, to the peace process, etc. But we've tended to see on these, when it comes to their relationship with Israel, is actually more and more carrots. And even during this war, after the initial kind of almost full backing for the operations and the invasion, and then as time went by, you start to see European countries step back and actually insist, no, actually a ceasefire is vital. The humanitarian aid is absolutely crucial. But again, you did not actually see the way that Europe's economic ties were not seriously affected. There were some attempted sanctions against West Bank settlers due to increased violence over there, but these are very individual and not really effective and not intricate to the Israeli settlement enterprise. And even just in the past few weeks and few months, we're still seeing very little movement from the European end on this front. Even now with the ICC question and the ICJ question, for all the declarations about supporting international rules-based order and at least respecting even the arrest warrants, you're now seeing even European countries either chip away, as we saw today with Hungary officially announcing its withdrawal from the ICC and the Rome Statute, to countries like Germany, even France, are basically trying to look for loopholes to avoid having to arrest someone like Benjamin Netanyahu, who's still got an impending warrant, or Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister. And obviously the Hamas suspects have all been assassinated by now. Now, there could be more warrants in the future down the line, and whether it's a Palestinian official or an Israeli official, but I think the ways that European countries are also bending back to avoid these questions about the rule of law, even just to allow further investigations into what are quite well documented war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is a very serious and alarming issue. It means that the conditions on the ground for increasing pressure, especially on Israel as the occupying power, as the one that's also re-entered this war quite aggressively, that there's very little reason for Israel to shift course. It is not seeing a cost or consequence to actually alleviating those situations. But of course, those costs are being quite severely being placed on the Palestinians, on Hamas through that military force. So as long as those conditions remain very lopsided, I'm not sure you will actually get to a situation where we can come to a more constructive political program, especially from a Palestinian perspective, especially with Palestinians on the ground. Much to be said, but
it's incumbent upon me to offer the other perspective on this. So significant fault line again here, I think an area where there is going to be tension here in Washington, particularly with the Trump administration. On UNRWA, of course, there's an alternative. It would require political will, significant amounts of technical expertise to do it, but there are plenty of UN organizations who could replace the UNRWA network and provide these services. There are paths to this, and it would also require acknowledgement of the workers in UNRWA who participated in the October 7th terrorist attacks that killed Israelis. So this, I think, is going to be a core tension. And the same thing with the ICC. The ICC is supposed to step in when a country does not have its own system for accountability and investigations. And so this idea of lopsided pressure, that more pressure needs to be brought on Israel, I think is exactly where the tension is going to come in with the United States going forward. Because what the United States wants to see, particularly from Europe, is more pressure on the Hamas side and more condemnation, not of Israel's actions, but of Hamas's actions.
No, this is fascinating. Thank you very much to both for these thoughts. I know we have to end, but maybe just to ask you if I can just keep you for 3 more minutes for a last question that I really wanted to ask, and I think it will only sort of help us reflect even further. And it's a question different for you two. For you, Dana, I think yesterday you published an article in Foreign Affairs, very very insightful, and I remember you talked there about strategic stabilization in the region. Perhaps maybe in 1 minute you can tell us how do you see the strategic stabilization in the region? And for you, Amjad, just a very broad and reflective question on the two-state solution, and it relates to sort of leadership, something that I think it's very important. what kind of leadership do you think would be needed so we could head on a path of getting to a two-state solution? I know it's a very sort of broad question, but I would sort of very much appreciate any thoughts on sort of what kind of leadership do you think it would be needed for getting to a two-state solution? Maybe Dana, I'll start with you if that's all right, and then we'll end. Thank you so much.
I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. So the point of my article is that in the United States, when we think through what a military campaign can achieve, there's another phase after active combat called stabilization. And stabilization is never intended to be done through uniformed military. It is supposed to be done by diplomats, by technical assistance providers. It requires not only humanitarian aid, but the kinds of aid that helps communities recover and think through what their lives, rebuild their lives after combat could look like. Clearing rubble, clearing unexploded ordnance, returning to their communities, getting their kids back in school, getting the economy going, not just bottles of water, but how do you get clean water, sanitation, basic governance, you need law enforcement. These are not things that a military entity can provide. And across the Middle East, we were in a ceasefire moment in Gaza. Right now we're back to combat, but at some point there will be another ceasefire or cessation of hostilities. I personally hope sooner rather than later. Lebanon, the same thing. Syria, the same thing. Yemen, the same thing. What is not really being discussed, particularly in Washington right now, is how we work with allies and partners to provide stabilization on the other side of what we've seen here, which in the case of Lebanon and in Gaza is more than a year of active war, and in the case of Syria or Yemen, more than a decade of active war. And it can't be the United States alone, but there's certainly a role for the United States. And what the article tried to shed light on is the exact kind of tools that you would need are not more sanctions and not more aircraft carriers and military forces. It's diplomats, it's assistance, and it's technical experts that understand the inherently political tasks of how you rebuild and stabilize on the other side of conflict.
And on the leadership question, I mean, a keystone to all of this is the Palestinian leadership. And when you ask most Palestinians, there's a great amount of anger and resentment towards their entire political elites. That goes to the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah Party, that goes to Hamas, it goes to the PLO, which was historically the leadership and now has become completely defunct, to the PA and the structures in which prop it up. And so you sense this, throughout Palestinian society, and whatever. Back in 2021, for example, when there was on the cusp of Palestinian elections in the occupied territories, which eventually got nixed for several reasons, but you could sense that that energy was really there. There was a huge desire to try to reassert and reclaim, especially representative leadership that could capture a society that's very different from what the elites have to offer, viewing them as authoritarian, viewing them as reactionary, viewing them as corrupt, and so on and so forth. Where Palestinians are standing, even as they despise the parties, for some reason or the other, a lot of them are able to get behind the idea that if at least Fatah and Hamas especially can create a national program and actually reunite under the framework of the PLO especially, or the PA, there are different debates about this, but at least if you can get those parties on the same page, it's at least a first stage to reorganizing the Palestinian politic, and with the hope that it can eventually lead to elections, which of course requires stabilization, especially of Gaza. It requires the people in Gaza being able to survive and live. It requires the West Bank to be calm. But again, these are conditions that these kind of political processes cannot take place under fire by any means. So the desire is there, but the space for that, the fact that Palestinians have to fight both against two rather authoritarian and obstinate leaderships, in addition to Israel as the occupying power, as the occupying force, as well as these regional internet and larger superpowers that are also trying to have a say in how Palestinian politics are being determined. So they're up against many things, and this is really a keystone to determine so much of the future. And there's also much to say about the Israeli leadership, but there's a lot of constant lively activity going on. But there again, there's also the fact that Israeli politics and society is still quite firmly right wing, even as there's a lot of internal battles within the right. But all of this again is also quite very deeply tied to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his fate. And as long as he remains the kind of the primary kingpin of that political scene, you will continue to see this constant chaos and an inability to kind of shift towards a more constructive direction. So as long as Netanyahu and Abbas remain there and the structures that they've put in place remain like that, then those leaderships will not be able to go forward on anything. I mean, this was brought on the question of the two-state solution, but I would sort of push back in the sense that the questions about its viability, about interests and disinterests in it, I think in the end, it's more important not to kind of focus on the conditions that are needed on the ground in order to even begin proper conversations about where Israelis and Palestinians need to head. Unfortunately, the two-state solutions tend to be a bit more too discursive, especially in Europe, as just sort of a gesture to say without putting the political weight behind altering and recalibrating those conditions on the ground. So it's important to focus on that process, and only then I think can you get Israelis and Palestinians on board to think more assertively about more comprehensive agreement. But I think we're far off from that right now.
I feel this conversation can just go on, and then we will never stop. But unfortunately, we have to finish. Thank you very much for your insights, for staying with us a bit longer to go deeper into some topics. This leaves me to wish you to continue to have a good morning or a good afternoon, and we'll continue our series of events on the Middle East with another discussion in about a month time. Thank you very much for joining.